is among those who met the president this morning. Olivier Faure suggesting his party, though, would be willing to work with the government on some issues. Take a listen.
I came to tell Emmanuel Macron that the country isn't stuck. Some reforms that he put forward in a hurried way are blocked. But there's a will on our side to move forward, such as with purchasing power. So if, for example, the president is ready to increase minimum wage to €1,500, he'll have a majority for this. If he wants to revalue retirement pensions and put them on the same level as the minimum wage, we'll support it. If he wants to block the prices of essential products, we'll also back it.
So how might French politics shape up then in the weeks and months ahead? Let's get some analysis with Jim Shields. He's a professor of French politics at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Thanks very much for talking to us on France 24 today, Professor. Some positive signs there, perhaps, from the socialists in that soundbite, but it does sound like a hard no from the Republican Party as to a formal deal with President Macron. So what are the president's next options? Does he have a hope of securing a formal coalition, in your opinion?
Well, the president's problem is this. If, like François Mitterrand in 1988, he were a dozen seats short of a majority, the gap could be closed with non-aligned deputies and a few breakaway members of other parliamentary groups on specific pieces of legislation. The problem is that Macron is over 40 seats short of a majority, and only a solid governing alliance would allow him to close that gap. And by the way, the socialists don't have nearly enough seats for that, even if they wanted it. The only candidates for such an alliance would be the centre-right Republicans. Macron can look for little support further to the right from Le Pen's National Rally, but he doesn't want his centrist alliance to be held ransom by the Republicans. And the official line of the Republicans is, as you've rightly said, no deal with Macron. So Macron may be left in the position of having to piece together support for every bill put forward, support on the left, maybe for social solidarity and environmental measures, support on the centre-right for some more difficult economic measures, such as raising the retirement age from 62 to 65 or reforming the welfare benefit system. Could that work? It's a big question, but it may be the only option to avoid parliamentary paralysis and ultimately, perhaps, a dissolution of the National Assembly and fresh elections. But that would be a very dangerous route to go down, as Jacques Chirac found in 1997 when he was landed with 5 years of cohabitation with a plural left majority similar in makeup to the NUPES Union of the Left today.
Indeed, and this kind of political uncertainty, relatively unusual here in France. So I wonder whether you think this may be a sign of far greater uncertainty to come if Macron does have to work on a case-by-case basis, on a bill-by-bill basis. What does French political reality look like? Will he be able to get anything through? And are we simply going to have plenty of elections? Is it kind of looking like an Italian model of real turbulence? What do you think?
We just don't know. We've never been here before. I've never seen a National Assembly as difficult to work with for a president as this one is. That having been said, this National Assembly is much more democratic than we're used to seeing. It reflects the politically fragmented makeup of the country. Usually the two-round winner-take-all voting system in these elections amplifies and distorts majorities for mainstream parties and pushes out more radical challenger parties like the National Rally or La France Insoumise. In this National Assembly, we have a much more accurate reflection of a country drawn to three political poles: a centrist pole around Macron, a far-right pole around Le Pen, and a far-left pole around Mélenchon, and with very little in between. except for the centre-right Republicans who don't know whether they want to be in Macron's gang or in Le Pen's. So although it's a difficult National Assembly, it's actually a much better reflection of the country than the outgoing assembly was.
A better reflection of the country, and therefore clearly there is a real chunk of France that is supporting the extreme right. Do you think Marine Le Pen's party, as a result of this election, has become almost entirely normalised then here in France?
Oh, this is one of the big features, if not indeed the big feature, the big surprise of this election. The collapse of Macron's majority is one thing, but the spectacular progression of Le Pen's party is another. Le Pen's party already achieved a historic high in the first round of these elections with 19% of the vote. This had never been seen. It was the only party with a clear upward momentum, while Macron's party lost heavily and the parties of the left stayed more or less stable. And if we look back at the presidential election of April, in that runoff, Le Pen won 41%, 13 million votes, up from 33%, 10 million votes in 2017. So there has been a growing reservoir of support into which National Rally candidates were able to tap. Winning 89 seats now shows how the party is setting down roots, even in elections that are notoriously difficult for it to do well in. Le Pen's party, I should say, also benefited from the collapse of the so-called Republican Front, voters turning out en masse to support any candidate facing a National Rally candidate. This simply didn't function in these elections.
And what do you think Le Pen's priorities will now be in this parliament? I mean, you've suggested that a deal with Macron would be politically untenable for him, but they are to meet this afternoon, aren't they? So what do you think they'll be talking about?
They are to meet this afternoon, and I don't see that particular meeting leading to much. Le Pen is she heads up the most solid bloc. We're beginning to see fragmentation of the NUPES left union. We're seeing fragmentation of the centre-right Republicans. They're breaking up a bit, looking to go in different directions. Le Pen's bloc is solid, and it will be the main party of opposition. Although the NUPES alliance adds up to more, party by party, Le Pen's will be the strongest. What she will look to do is to use this parliamentary platform to secure her party's place in the political landscape, and importantly for her, to start already building her platform, building her campaign for the next presidential elections in 2027. That's why she's not going to go back to be head of the National Rally. She's leaving that with Jordan Bardella. She says her job now is to head up this parliamentary group. So she clearly already has an eye on building her image as a major national stateswoman.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, given that Le Pen, before the presidential election, did say she didn't plan to run for the presidency again. But I want to ask you just briefly and finally, if I may, about that left-wing alliance we've been talking about, NUPES. They did do well, didn't they, in terms of vote numbers, but cracks are already starting to emerge in the alliance. It seems that they won't be a fixed bloc together in Parliament. Does it all sound rather familiar to you? You know, infighting on the French left. Why is the left in France so divided in your view? And does it sound a bit like other European countries as well? Is there a pattern?
Well, it's a big question, and it's certainly opposite. It does sound familiar, frankly. These are parties who are much more used to fighting each other than to collaborating. And the cracks are beginning to open over the simplest question: should they have a unified group, parliamentary group, or should they now dissolve into their separate party groups, the Socialists, the Ecologists, and La France Insoumise? This exposes the real nature of the union of the left, and it comes back to your question. This was a purely electoral arrangement where differences of policy and strategy separate the component parties. They simply don't have the ideological or policy coherence for a durable coalition. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more cracks appear in the NUPES left union as we move forward over the next weeks.
Professor Jim Shields, it's been really interesting to talk to you. Thanks very much, and we will indeed see what happens in the next few weeks. And of course, we'll bring it to our viewers here on France 24.
My pleasure.